Thank you all for coming tonight. I apologize for my voice. I don't know if it has allergies or whether it's the beginning of a cold, but whatever, I apologize for that. 150 years ago, on this date and about this hour, although we're not sure about the time change, whether it was daylight savings or train time, because the trains were set up, time schedules were set up so the trains would run on time. But anyway, I don't know. 150 years ago on this date, at about this hour, a railroad train left Seymour on a rainy Saturday night going east toward Cincinnati, carrying various forms of wealth being shipped via Adams Express Company to banks in the east. Two daring robbers, as they were described by the Adams Express Company, boarded that train in Seymour and gained entry into the express car as the train had barely left Seymour. They put their revolvers to the head of the express messenger, Elam Miller, and took his key, obtaining money, about $15,000, give or take a few thousand, from the local safe. Unable to open the through safes, containing about $30,000, they threw one of three from the train, pulled the bell rope to signal the engineer to stop or slow down, and then just before jumping from the train, pulled the rope again to signal him to go ahead. And they were between a half a mile and a mile east of the depot. So behind the state police post, maybe, if you know where that is, or the overpass on Burkhart Boulevard, that area. Not very far, and you have to wonder how fast the train could have picked up speed when they only went maybe, 40 miles an hour, 30, 40 miles an hour anyway. Don't know the answer to that. Once the robbery was made known by the messenger, the train stopped. Reports then vary on what happened next. The train backed up to where the safe was thrown off, or a handcar was taken back to the scene after the train reached the next station, or some of the men walked back to the scene. In any case, the through safe remained unopened, but the robbers got away. Eventually, the train continued on its eastern run. A reward of $5,000 offered by the Adams Express described two men as about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall, weighing 150 pounds each. So we have to assume the other person was on the outside waiting for him, probably with horses. The Indianapolis Journal reported that the two robbers in the express car wore pasteboard masks, one black and one white. Express detectives Larry Hazen of Cincinnati and John Egan of St. Louis were telegraphed to come. They met at Seymour on Monday morning, trailed the robbers to the house of Wilkes Reno, father of the Reno boys, watched them on a Tuesday as they bet on election outcomes with plenty of money to bet with, compared the size of foot tracks at the robbery scene to those made at the election site, found muddy clothing and revolvers, as well as masks at the Wilkes Reno house, and items stolen from the burglaries in the area. Counterfeiting equipment also was found, but apparently no money. On Wednesday, after the Saturday night robbery, detectives arrested John and Simeon Reno and Frank Sparks. On what grounds, we do not know, the Seymour Times wrote. It reported the following week that Wilkes Reno also had been charged. All were released on bond in a few days. Indictments were returned by a grand jury in the February term of Jackson Circuit Court. The accused remained free on bond. That same grand jury also indicted John Brooks and John Talley in the December murder of Marion Cutler at Clear Spring. Before they could be tried, Brooks and Talley were hanged by a mob in Brownstown on the town square, March 31st, 1867. On April 11, 1867, the Seymour Times ran a wrap-up of the murders committed in Jackson County in recent years, like 2 years. Lynch law extenuation was the headline. An extenuation of the act of the people in taking the law in their own hands in the case of the murderous Brooks and Talley, we offer a brief enumeration of the crimes committed in the county of Jackson recently, as occur to mind at the moment. He lists 14 instances and a few more attempted murders, and then he goes back later and adds that he forgot a few murders, so he adds those in. The following week, the Times wrote, "We continue our sketch of recent crimes committed with impunity in the county, remarking that in our notice of the murders last week, a number of cases were omitted where men have been found dead upon the railroad tracks under circumstances that made it almost certain that they had been murdered and thrown there. We also omit even an enumeration of the rapes of which we have had a number of well-developed cases and with no lack of proof, but only one case has got beyond the Justice of Peace Court. We have space merely to enumerate the robberies and will premise that no man has been convicted or punished for any of them." Isn't that kind of amazing? I mean, that all this stuff was going on and nobody's convicted of anything. His story, Dr. Monroe's story in the Seymour Times, was picked up by other papers. And the New Albany paper wrote, "There's a terrible amount of crime in Jackson County. Murders and robberies are common. The laws are held in defiance. There have been 16 murders committed in that county in the past 2 years, most of them shockingly cold-blooded and premeditated. The law-loving citizens are becoming much alarmed at this condition of affairs and are determined to put an end to it, even though it be necessary in order to do so, to take the law into their own hands and visit sudden and condign punishment upon the offenders." But let's look back a little further. What was Seymour's history like before October 6, 1866? And what was its close relationship, Seymour's close relationship to Rockford? I'm going to jump around a bit on the dates, on the earlier dates, but I believe you can follow enough to get a picture of what happened in the mid-1850s and 60s. "1866 was neither the beginning nor the end. In 1857, March 1st, a letter from Levi Booth, a Presbyterian minister to the American Home Missionary Society, said the Seymour Presbyterian Church has 35 members, 4 from Brownstown, and the German Reformed is the only other church in town. This is one of the most destitute fields in Indiana. The congregation is 100 to 150, but not to be depended upon. They've had no Christian training, and many are transients from the railroad. And we all know what bad people those railroad people are. I would guess everybody here has some railroad person. Seymour had 10 liquor shops for 500 inhabitants and an immense number of drunkards. The governor reported in 1855 that it is his unpleasant duty to call to your attention the fact that in some portions of the state, indications of the existence of a spirit of mob law and violence have appeared. Secret associations usurping the prerogatives of law have, by means of disturbing the peace of families, injuring property, and inflicting corporal punishment on individuals, undertaken to regulate the morals of the communities in which such lawless combinations are permitted to exist. Civil officers and peaceful citizens, fearful of incurring the dangerous hostility of members of these secret associations, allowed their lawless acts to pass without punishment and almost without public censure. The inevitable tendency of these secret associations is to corrupt the morals of the community and to divest men of their respect for law and order. The governor recommends that grand juries be used to protect the informants because they do fear retaliation. But how they would keep their names exactly secret, I am not sure, because I would think that it wouldn't be too hard to find out. But anyway, even before that, things had been happening. In Jackson County, some mysterious fires had destroyed property. In 1857, the Rockford Herald reported that on May 29th, Hostel's Old Tavern stand in Rockford was destroyed by fire between 10 and 11 p.m. the previous Friday. The Old Tavern had long been occupied occupied by as a grocery by Adeline Robertson Reed. It was much frequented and had a bad reputation. The Herald said well-meaning citizens thought that she was poisoning the morals of the youth of the vicinity and also of several others whose business she injured. Very little was saved from the fire. A note was mailed to the Herald from, Mohawk Wigwam, May 23rd, 1857. I'm assuming this is a secret society, but I don't know. This is to warn all persons that harbors Ad Reed or takes her part to beware, for we are determined to rid the town of her and all other doggeries. Signed, Solomon Bashel, Secretary of the Corners, Big Tires and Red Rover, President. Editor Herald, please publish. The Old Rockford census in 1860, this is 3 years later, lists Adeline Reed, 34, born in Kentucky, and in the same household, Frank Reno, 23, born in 1837, and they're both listed as whiskey sellers. Next door are William and Rachel Hare, both 44, from New York. He's listed as a fisherman in Rockford. Martha Hare, 22, and Emily Hare, 17, I assume they're daughters, are each listed as Lady DuPave. Think about that one. And the other Hares, little Hares, are Amanda, 14, born in Illinois, Nicholas, 9, and Curtis, 2, both born in Indiana. And living next door is Pollard Abel, 35, a stud horse keeper. The other Abels are William, 7, David, 5, and Cordelia, 3. James Smallwood, 65, also is in the household. So, like I said, Adeline was in the vicinity still 3 years later. They hadn't succeeded in driving her out. And I really would like to know, and wasn't able to narrow it down, there are maybe two Adeline Reeds in the community, and one of them was originally Adeline Robertson, and it looks like she did marry a Reed, but I still think it's possible that there are two different ones, so if you think she might have been your ancestor, you might want to check a little more closely, because but I think she is buried in the Robertson Cemetery. But again, I need to do more checking on this. The Robertson Cemetery out in the Crook and in the road, in what, Brownstown or Hamilton? Yeah, Honeytown, that'll work. Okay. In 1852, Seymour was laid out then by Median Eliza Shields at the planned crossing of the East-West Ohio and Mississippi Railroad over the Jeffersonville and Indianapolis, which was then under construction. The crossing, as in this town, is named for Hezekiah Cook Seymour, the civil engineer who surveyed the O&M line but didn't live to see the town evolve, which is why he never shows up for any of the programs later marking the railroad coming and all that. In 1853, John M. Bishop of New Albany, a Presbyterian minister, reports after a visit that Seymour's growth is practically unbelievable. I mean, there are comments in the paper about things just going on day and night as far as construction and the sawmill being built and all that good stuff. Between 1854 and 1857, the O&M began to carry traffic from Cincinnati and points east to Vincennes, Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. In 1855, a Presbyterian missionary named Charles T. White, just out of cemetery, asks for support from the American Home Missionary Society to support his ministry at the Presbyterian Church in Seymour, which has 7 members, including 2 males. Considerable opposition to the church is attributed to the railroad influence for intemperance, profanity, and Sabbath breaking. Methodists and United Brethren of Seymour are good folks, but the Baptists oppose him because they accidentally discovered that he's an abolitionist. They are all heathens or Quakers here as far as paying the preacher is concerned. About every other letter that he wrote back to New York was asking for money because he hadn't been paid. I don't know what he lived on. 1856, he adds that Seymour now has some 400 inhabitants and the railroad brings bad folks who keep the groceries and the whiskey shops going full blast. The Presbyterian women have organized a sewing society to raise money for a new church building. Levi Booth is expected to succeed White soon. And this church building that they're raising money for would be at 2nd and Chestnut on the southwest corner, which eventually was built and blew down in a storm, but I can't tell you the date of that off the top of my head. In 1857, the Seymour Times is started by J.R. Monroe, who moved from Rockford, where he had the Rockford Herald for a couple of years before that, because he moved because Meady Shields sort of made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And I would like to know what that offer is. But I haven't found out yet. I'm working on it. Sam Holmes, 27, is admitted as an attorney in the Jackson County Common Pleas Court. He heads a group of 24 men organizing a working men's McClure library open to any white male over 14 years of age who earns his living by the sweat of his brow in some honorable occupation. The Aaron Stryker family reports in letters that they wrote that are now in the Indiana Historical Society that the railroad now has been running 2 trains a day and in June plans to run 6, doing a large business in both freight and passengers. An out-of-county newspaper reports little hope of recovery for a dead drunk man run over by a passenger train near Bologna. An almost daily occurrence because whiskey is sold at little rum holes every 300 yards along the road between Washington and Seymour. The practice of dousing men who exhibit themselves stupidly or uproariously drunk upon the streets with buckets of cold water may have originated in Seymour, the Times reported, and seems effective in suppressing such behavior. I can't really imagine that, but whatever. Education is reported by a missionary to be at as low an ebb as religion. So that's interesting. Chills and fever of every kind abound, and the whole region has been sickly. Not a family in Seymour escaped, but fewer deaths occurred than in the previous year. So things are getting better. Okay. In 1860, a shipping crate handled by the Adams Express Company breaks open on the railroad platform at Seymour as it's being transferred from the J&I to the O&M for shipment to Levi Coffin in Cincinnati. Alexander McClure, a slave hidden in the crate, is discovered and returned to slavery by the Express Company, I might add. 1861, the bombing of Fort Sumter finds Meady Shields and Sam Holmes addressing a meeting at Brownstown and war volunteers going off to join military units. Preacher Levi Booth reports what war is crushing people and many prosperous businesses are about to fail. 1862, Reno advertises best quality, low rates for fresh groceries. Farmers can sell their produce for market prices at his store on the southeast corner of Chestnut at the O&M Railroad. Concerns on the home front include streets and sidewalks needing work and mud holes impeding progress. Apparently, Seymour was built on a swamp and had to really fight it for years and years, and maybe still does to some extent. Jason B. Brown, a 23-year-old attorney seeking election to the state legislature, is charged with using treasonable language during a debate in Seymour. He's arrested and taken to Indianapolis, but he evades the charge and later leads a legislative investigation into similar arrests around the state. In 1863, Morgan's raid gave concerns, so Captain Meady Shields, who then was, I believe, 56 or 59, got on an old wheeler and drilled the locals up and down Chestnut Street, or 2nd Street, with his own horses and mules. April 1863, the Seymour Times reports that Gilbert and Company store and post office at Jonesville has been burgled. Grant Wilson and Samuel Dixon said that they hauled the goods away and hid them near New Farmington for white men. Y'all know where New Farmington is? South along the railroad, about 2 miles from the edge of town, maybe 3 miles. Okay. 4 blacks were arrested. Wilson was hanged by the neck several times before he confessed and implicated the others. He and Dixon were held in jail. There are no other names in the report. In September 1865, the Seymour Times reported that Gradison Wilson was shot and killed August 30th near his Hamilton Township home, apparently by men he recognized. The Jonesville case still was pending in U.S. District Court, and the whole matter hung on Wilson's testimony. The last I found, the case was still hanging around. Not today. I mean, as far as I know, it's not still there. Surely it's been dismissed by now. But in any case, in addition to this, Wilson was privy to and probably an accomplice in most of the robberies, house burnings, and counterfeiting enterprises perpetrated hereabouts by the gang of desperados that have given Rockford an unenviable notoriety for several years past. And the belief now gaining ground that the testimony of colored witnesses will be taken into account in any court at no distant date afforded sufficient motive for the murder of one in possession of such important secrets. Interested parties are suspected and will probably find it hard to escape the vengeance of the law. At that point, the testimony of individuals of color was not accepted in the courts, and it changed around that time. I can't tell you exactly when. The Times also reported that Grant Wilson was only about 1/8 black, and there is some indication that he was related to the Renos, like a distant cousin. In 1868, well, the case was still pending, the last I found, in 1868, against Frank Reno and possibly others. April 1863, Seymour Times, a German preacher and schoolteacher named Borchers, living near Jonesville, was robbed of $150 in gold, partly gold and silver, and partly treasury notes. 4 robbers had blackened their skin and roughed up Mr. Borchers. Summer of 1863, that was, I read earlier that Beatty Shields drilled the people for Morgan's raid to have defense for Seymour. October 1864, Aurora Commercial, guerrilla groups stealing horses and robbing houses in southern Indiana has become an activity. Jesse Worley, an Aurora police detective, said that the group had proceeded so far as to engage in a plot to rob a railroad train. Now, this is 2 years before the robbery we're here to talk about tonight. So I object to the designation of the first train robbery. Sorry, it wasn't. It wasn't even close. Jesse Worley said that they had proceeded so far as to plot to rob a railroad train, in which they believed a large sum of money would be found. Hoosiers, led by one of Morgan's men, was connected with the Sons of Liberty being exposed by the Dodd trial in Indianapolis. So people were sort of following this thing as much as they could through the newspapers. In 1864, James and Meady Fissler and Simeon Reno were charged with counterfeiting. In 1865, the Seymour Times publishes the names of nearly 7 dozen individuals and a few businesses charged the 5% tax on incomes over $600. So there was some prosperity in the area. Lawlessness also is flourishing, the Times observes, and calls for vigilante action to end assaults, robberies, and murders. This is in 1865. Report is made of an express train thrown from a track torn up by thieves as a train is leaving Cincinnati. No one is hurt, but thieves thrust revolvers in the faces of the passengers and take their money and valuables. The Adams Express safe also is robbed. Again, this is in 1865, a year before the October 6, 1866 robbery. Okay, February 1865, Mrs. Joel Richards is robbed at her home in Hamilton Township. Her husband's away in the Army. 3 men, 2 with their faces blackened and otherwise disguised, demanded all the money she had. She was sick in bed and gave them all she had, $2. They didn't believe her, so they put a rope around her neck and hanged her from the projection on the smokehouse more than once until she was nearly dead. The New Albany Ledger called for a vigilant committee to hunt down and hang the scoundrels. So it wasn't just the Seymour Times calling for some action on what was going on around here. Okay, October 1865, William Maurer is beaten so badly at the Arbor Saloon where he was employed that he died. Blood clot found on the brain and his skull was broken, etc. A special meeting of the Seymour City Council inquires into whether any city officer has neglected his duty. Stormy meeting results in the committee appointed to investigate. The people are becoming disgusted with the administration of justice, and a new leaf has got to be turned over, the Times reported. Okay, October 1865. This continues for a while in October. The victim was beaten while crying for mercy, that William Maurer. The Times asks, why should an honest-minded justice of the peace be blamed for seeing no criminality in this, when the President of the United States is pardoning from 2,000 to 3,000 a day of the monstrous and bloody murderers of their thousands each? You know who he's talking about? The Confederates. They were pardoned instead of being treated as traitors. Robbery is carried on with impunity. Quote, nobody is convicted. There is a horrible suspicion among the honest masses that the officers elected to enforce the laws are, as a general rule, in league with the freebooters, rowdies, and lawbreakers of all grades. The careful observer will perceive that when criminals are brought before the democratic justices and judges, they almost invariably go clear. And you have to remember that in this time period, things were almost reversed from what they are today as far as Democrat and Republican. That the Republicans were they were anti-slavery, and the Democrats, the democracy in Indiana, was pro-slavery. The committee appointed by the council last week to inquire into the official acts of the mayor and the marshal performed that painful duty and made a report exonerating the mayor from dereliction of duty, but asking the marshals to resign. The report was concurred in, and Marshal Story handed in his resignation, but afterwards withdrew it and demanded that if he resigned, a new election should be ordered and that the matter be thus referred to the people who elected him. As an election can't be legally called for that purpose, we don't know what the result of the matter will be. Mayor Green receives a dispatch from someone signing himself marshal, asking what reward the authorities will give for the arrest of Tuttle and the 2 Chandlers who were engaged in the Maurer murder. A council meeting was called, and the mayor was authorized to pay $160 for the 3. The town already had paid $100 for a person to pursue the men with a promise of daily pay in addition. The person hired hadn't been heard from. Imagine that. Probability that the accused parties are bidding for the reward themselves, and the town is to pay the lawyers for clearing them. Is anybody a big enough fool to believe that they will go clear if tried? All they will suffer, the guys that they're brought in, by a return is what the lawyers and others engaged in dispensing Jackson County justice see fit to extort from them, and if they are sharp enough to make the town pay the other money there. Major Gordon and Mr. James Pullen, charged with being parties to the murder of William Moore, were before Esquire Carter on Friday, and I think this Esquire Carter would be Justice of the Peace Travis Carter, but I need to do further checking on that. The case was removed to Brownstown and tried before Esquire Beadle, who also happened to run the Jackson County Union down there, the newspaper, resulting, as we predicted it would, in the acquittal of the accused. What was the use for town authorities to expend a large sum in endeavors to arrest the other parties implicated when it was well enough known that if arrested, the most positive and overwhelming proof would fail to convict? Such mockery of justice as is dispensed in Jackson County is an insult to every honest man and woman in the community. The Bloomington Republican ran an editorial reprinted in the October 19th Seymour Times. The Golden Circle is dead. That's the Knights of the Golden Circle, which you may have heard of in connection with the Walla, the Civil Walla. But the Silver Circle, or Confederacy of Crime, after which it was modeled and out of which it was largely formed, still lives. And it lives to plunder and rob the industrious and the honest by every form of crime known in our land, from burglary, robbery, and murder down to pocket picking. And the traitors, when caught and fairly convicted, ought to be hung. They join a great conspiracy of crime for a lifelong and systematic warfare against honest humanity. The enormity of the crime is not in the amount stolen, but in the conspiracy and organized rebellion against society. Seymour Times, October 25th, 1865. The people will pretty soon be ready to act upon the frequently repeated suggestions of this paper to organize in self-defense against the organized bands of thieves and cutthroats that infest the county. Nothing but lynch law will ever be of the slightest avail. Let a public meeting be called, a vigilance committee formed, and the place made too hot for the thieves. Every man who has property in Seymour or feels an interest in its prosperity should assist in expelling from the place and county all idlers, gamblers, and others who have no visible means of support. What with that? Even if you hang some of them, I don't know. Okay, October 26, 1865, shortly after an ordinance prohibiting concealed carry, the ordinance sets fine not exceeding $3 for anyone who unlawfully assaults another in Seymour. 2 or more persons fighting by agreement in Seymour, if found guilty of a fray, shall be fined not more than $20 in costs and may be imprisoned not more than 10 days. Okay. I wonder how often that was enforced after it was passed. I don't know. Okay. And then this. The Seymour Times, September 1865. Governor Morton called the legislature into special session for Monday, November 13th. Meanwhile, a telegraph from Indianapolis to the Cincinnati Enquirer, published as a special dispatch November 12th, said, a gang of Negro desperados, contrabands that have infested the vicinity of Seymour have just been broken up in consequence of one of the villains turning state's evidence relative to the post office robbery. Several murders are revealed as having been committed by them. The chief offenders are in custody. Really? Who were they? Okay. Seymour Times wrote in response to that telegraph published by the Enquirer, in the matter referred to in the dispatch, in which the guilty parties are paraded before the world as a gang of Negro desperados and contrabands, it is well known that every person connected in any way with the robbery of the post office were white men, except one, Grant Wilson, who had perhaps not more than 1/8 Negro blood in him, and he recently lost his life by violence at the hands of some white man whose name is unknown. The item blames those who apparently lost the war and publish obvious falsehoods to defame blacks in any way possible, to appeal to those who may have a little weakness left for slavery and rebellion. Such a publication, of course, receives only the contempt in and around Seymour that it deserves. Here it is known to be false. Okay. way. They say so. I think the Inquirer must have been the Fox News of the day. Okay, November 30th, 1965. The Chandler boys appeared before Esquire Carter and were acquitted. It now appears that Maurer wasn't murdered. It was all a mistake. The physicians thought they held a post-mortem on the body of Maurer, beaten to death of several men known to everybody in town. But it couldn't have been so. The coroner and his jury also were mistaken. Nobody was killed. Nobody was guilty of killing. These facts are sustained by law. In other words, the court had ruled that there was no murder. There was no... But the witnesses and physicians still believe, such law and lawyers and justices as Jackson County affords to the contrary notwithstanding. The witnesses and the physicians still believe that there was a murder. In 1866, Seymour's founders, Meade and Eliza Shields, died in February and November, respectively. The Times again notes that the town needs to rid itself of decaying rubbish, stagnant water, and decaying filth. There are reports of decaying hogs laying on the depot platform. It's like, ew. Marshal George Slagle, and some of you may be related to him, resigns, alleging that Mayor George Green places maximum fines against those he doesn't like while letting off lightly those guilty of grave offenses. On October 6th, then, 1866, the robbers throw an Adams Express safe from the express car on the eastbound O&M just east of Seymour. In 1867, which is maybe 6 months later, maybe not quite, vigilantes hanged Brooks and Talley, the two that were accused of murdering Marion Cutler in a particularly graphic way, throwing something over her head and smothering her. She was not totally, well, she wasn't exactly insane, but she's sort of like me, sort of dowdy out of it, spacey. Anyway, the vigilantes hanged Brooks and Talley at Brownstown before they could be tried for murdering her. The Times again enumerates the crimes in the area, as I mentioned at the beginning. In 1868, the robbers again stopped trains to take money from the Adams Express safe, first the JM&I at Marshfield, just south of Jackson County in Scott County, and then on the O&M east of Brownstown. But at Brownstown, the robbers are caught before they can be tried, are taken from custody by vigilantes and hanged at the infamous Hangman's Crossing just west of Seymour. Later the same year, the three Reno brothers and a friend were hanged by vigilantes at the New Albany jail. Okay, some things to follow up on. And I know that may not have been what you were expecting in regard to the Renos, but I think it's important to understand the background of where people were coming from to form vigilance committees and feel that they had to do something. Okay, some things to follow up on. April 1866, the New Albany Ledger reported that U.S. Detective Worley was shot in the left shoulder when someone shot through the window as the Jeffersonville train was leaving Seymour about 10 p.m. Worley seemed to know who shot him, but did not take steps to have an arrest made. Now, the Indianapolis paper identified this person as Seymour Barmore, this detective. And it says that he was shot. So who is this Barmore, and where does he fit into all this? Because he's been around for a while, and he has ads in the Cincinnati paper advertising himself as the world's greatest detective. And he also is the infamous man in black velvet who hung around Indianapolis and was reported in the paper day after day after day. They made a game almost of reporting this guy hanging around in his black velvet outfit. And I'm fascinated by Barmore. Here's an affidavit that he filed in January 1867. He alleged that 8 barrels and 2 sacks of dried apples were stolen from Hiram Johnson on Chestnut Ridge by Robert Smith and fenced Adolph Hill in Seymour. He heard Smith tell about the apples while riding on a train to Louisville with Smith and William Reno. Subpoenas were issued for Valentine Smith, Fielding Johnson, David Harris, William Reno, Andrew Smith, and Adolph Hill. Jason B. Brown is the attorney for Robert Smith. Okay, in August of 1868, Jason B. Brown is the attorney for Seymour Barmore after Barmore's wife files for divorce in Jackson County, although she appears to live in Columbus or someplace other than Jackson County. And I don't know what the requirements, maybe you could live in another county then. And a non-resident notice was published in the papers for Seymour Barmore. Brown, meanwhile, has been elected to the state legislature and eventually becomes Secretary of Wyoming Territory before returning to Seymour and getting elected to the U.S. Congress. Barmore eventually, as in the summer or fall of 1868, is initiated into the SAC degree of the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee, where it turns out he's working undercover for the governor, Governor Brownlow, Parson Brownlow. In January, he's taken from a train in Tennessee by men wearing masks, red masks. Sound familiar? Supposedly members of the Klan. His body is found in March floating in the Duck River. Examination reveals that he's been hanged, shot, stabbed, and drowned. They got him. Some reports said that he might not have been dead at all because his body, or something, is reported to have been shipped to his family in Michigan. His name is written in the death records up there, but then they're crossed out and there's no stone for him, no marker, which isn't too unusual, but still, you would think if they went to the trouble to ship him up there that they might have put a marker up. Okay, we got a few minutes left. John Reno, you might recall, during the hanging of his companions and brothers, was serving a 25-year sentence for safe burglary in Missouri. Cases in Jackson County for grand larceny and robbery were dropped in 1872, so 5 years, 66, 7 years. The 25 years in Missouri was commuted in a very complicated fashion to 10 years, and in 1878, detectives Larry Hazen and John Egan, who arrested the father and brothers for the 1866 robbery, brought John back to the jail at Brownstown because there were still charges pending against him. Shortly after John's return, the Banner reported, I love this, it's just like today, one of our bon-tons of the female persuasion was in the post office Saturday and rushing up to Mr. G said, "Ain't that John Reno yonder?" "Yes," Mr. G said, "I believe it is." So she raced up to the gentleman and took him by the hand and said, "John, oh, I'm so glad to see you. You're looking fresher than I expected to see." And the guy says, "Who do you take me for, madam?" "Why, I thought you was John Reno." "Not much, but John is in town. However, my name is," and the paper didn't give his name. She realized her mistake, made a beeline for the door and home. So long as he maintains an upright course through life, it is the duty of one and all to assist him, the Banner wrote of John Reno after he was back in Brownstown. He is fast gaining the confidence of the people, and no doubt justly too. Reno, there's a lot of interviews with Reno when he comes back. Reno told the Banner editor that he intended to farm or to engage in stone cutting, knowledge of which he gained in the Missouri Penitentiary. Long interviews followed. Rumors appear that Reno intends to murder James Flanders, the railroad engineer who helped capture gang members in the failed Brownstown robbery that led to the hanging of the 6 after they were caught. Meanwhile, John's trial for the 1866 robbery was postponed from spring until the September term, and bail was reduced from $18,000 to $5,000. One report said John Reno was running with about the same crowd as he had before imprisonment. A summer report said that he'd opened a first-class butcher shop and hired a Louisville butcher. I don't think that lasted very long. By February 1879, the robbery charge from 14 years earlier had been dropped because the witnesses were residing out of state, and Adams Express didn't seem inclined to prosecute. The Banner wrote, "We believe that the people of Jackson County are of the opinion that John Reno has already suffered enough and should suffer no further prosecution." Just to give you a little follow-up on John Reno after he came back. In April 1880, he was reported to have attacked and severely whipped Frank Beadle of the Seymour Monitor Journal, a temperance paper. Beadle was not the editor who had written what John objected to, but he got beaten anyway. The Monitor Journal had charged that Reno was running a Keno bank in the hall over Colleran's saloon. Reno is supposed to have said that he didn't object to the Keno story so much as to the review of the previous history of the train robberies and the Missouri prison term. He pleaded guilty and paid $8.80 in the mayor's court for each case. The next month, during city elections, additional fisticuffs occurred. In the late summer of 1880, John married Sarah Reno, his sister-in-law. 2 years later, he was reported shipping watermelons from Seymour, and they were large as any around. A little over another year later, Reno was reported involved in a Saturday night cutting affray in Clint Reno's saloon, cutting Pollard Abel in the head, arm, and back, puncturing his left lung. Abel survived. 3 of Reno's best horses were killed by a JM&I train at his farm 2 miles north of Seymour. In 1885, Reno was arrested at Seymour, apparently regarding attempts to pass counterfeit money with James Hardesty in Indianapolis. They eventually pled guilty. By 1888, he was free again. In 1891, he pled guilty to keeping a gaming house and was fined. He was stricken with paralysis and died in 1895. And then there are the stories told by Alan Pinkerton. Not going there tonight, maybe some other time. I think that Pinkerton is probably the person that started the world's first train robbery rumor. But if you go back and look, there were train robberies during the war years where sometimes the train was put off the tracks, but other times it was just somebody entered the car and threw the safe off and took the money. So, any questions? Yeah.
Why didn't you didn't mention anything about where the vigilantes came from that hung the Reno brothers?
I don't know.
Seriously?
Well, I have, a name here, a name there, nothing I can prove.
But you don't know where they're from?
Well, there are different stories. They came from Jackson County, they came from Seymour, they came from Jackson County, they came from surrounding counties, they came from out of state brought by Pinkerton. Notice that nothing happened with the vigilantes until until the 1866 robbery took some real money, which is more important, money or life. And I guess I'm cynical that way, but it seems to me like maybe nothing happened until the money was taken. So I don't know who they were. Yeah.
Was the name Leffingwell ever connected with the Reno Gang?
I don't know. I've seen the name, but I don't know if it was connected with or against. There's a tremendous, I started making a spreadsheet of all the characters that are involved in, with this time period one way or another, because there are so many and my memory's so bad that I can't keep them all straight. And then I lost the spreadsheet, but I intend to recreate it because it is necessary to know, I think.
What do you know about their sister?
Laura. Not a lot. course, vowed over the bodies in New Albany that she would have vengeance on the vigilantes, because she thought she knew who they were. And she, during the funeral, she ordered somebody to leave the funeral because he was one of the vigilantes in her mind. And then she went on to marry a railroad guy, and I need someday to do some more research into Mr. Gowdy, whether he, it'd be interesting, somebody brought this up the other day, and I'm going, I don't know, whether he was an engineer on the train, one of the trains that was robbed. We know it wasn't the Brownstown train, but we don't know on the others. But apparently she lived happily ever after. She got over, the newspapers reported that she no longer wanted vengeance within, 5 years or so. She wasn't out for vengeance anymore. Yeah.
I attended a program here at the library at least 10 years ago that was about the Reno brothers. And it seemed to me that the gentleman that spoke said something about one of the reasons many of these bad guys were back on the street was that there was some provision in the law back then that if people were found guilty of a crime and sentenced to go to jail, they could hire a surrogate to go to jail for them. And I distinctly remember from that program, and that was like mind-boggling. Oh, you're going to jail. I'll hire Joe over here, and he'll go instead. Is that part of this?
I probably was at the program. It probably was John M. Lewis that did the program.
The gentleman had written a book about them.
Yeah, probably was him. And, he usually had done his research, but I don't know. That sounds kind of
Okay. You just said tonight that a lot of times people were acquitted. They get accused.
Yeah,
some magistrate would just set them free again. They'd be back on the street doing the same thing over.
They didn't have to hire a substitute.
Yeah, they didn't have to hire anybody, just let them go. Okay, but anyway, you're not aware of any of that kind of activity?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Is there anything on the Big Brother plan?
Well, he sold vegetables on the corner of whatever, Chestnut Street and the L&N, I guess. Yeah, he occasionally was arrested for minor things like gambling or, but he wasn't in on the big stuff apparently, or if he was, he's smart enough to hide his involvement. But he was around, and there's no report that I have seen what he felt about the whole thing.
She was just leaving because Elk was playing.
Well, and we know a house that was his back in the day, and some subsequent people that owned it was ripping all through the house to see what they could find. And they came up with nothing.
Yeah, well, and I love the story. I don't know if this, I think, was the house on Indianapolis Avenue just north of 5th. And supposedly, the people that lived there eventually went out in the backyard and dug up money and went to Iowa or Kansas or somewhere out west and paid cash for a hotel. If I had a name, I could check. But I don't have a name. Would love to. Yeah.
Did the Ku Klux Klan get started in Seymour?
When? Back in the day?
Well, maybe back when all this was going on.
Yeah. Well, I personally...
What made Seymour such a roughneck place?
Yeah, but it was all of Indiana. Those reports from the governor kind of indicate it's just that Seymour eventually took action and hanged some of the people that were involved. And yeah, I think the Klan was here. And one of the arguments that a friend and I have, that she does a lot of research too, into the Reno era, is which side were the Renos on? Were they the Klan people or were they the others? And nothing makes sense to me. There's something I'm missing. Yeah.
Well, the Klan actually started like Tennessee, Nathan Bedford Forest. That's where the Klan got started.
But I think, I don't know, maybe I misunderstood.
The Klan, probably had very little to do with Seymour in its early days.
Oh, I disagree.
Well, in about that time, it rose to prominence in the early part of the 21st century, or 20th century
Well-
here, you know, but
But the governor wouldn't be sending out a message about it if it wasn't in existence, most likely.
well, it was in existence, but it was mostly a southern-driven thing, and, you know.
But Seymour Barmore went south to Tennessee after hanging out with the people here in Seymour and was killed, working against the Klan, infiltrating the Klan as an
Well, the Klan was prominent at that time in the 1860s, you know, they got started as a bulwark against the carpetbaggers coming down to the south, you know, more or less. And that was a vigilante organization in essence in the south.
There were a lot of connections between here and the south.
Yeah.
And the guy who started it, I always want to say Nathan Forrest, Bedford Forrest.
Nathan Bedford Forrest,
Thank you. By that time.
out of Memphis.
Within a few years, was trying to slow it down and pretend it never happened. But that doesn't mean it stopped.
Yeah, he started something and then I think it morphed into something that he didn't intend to,
Exactly.
you know.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think it's important to remember how important the railroad crossing in Seymour was, how rare that was, and especially in maybe making Seymour the center of activity, because there's a constant influx of new people who had to come here to change trains and so on.
Yeah. And the preachers blamed them for all the problems. So, yeah, it is indeed important to remember that it wasn't. There were a lot of other crossings, but this was the major crossing between Indianapolis and Louisville, and between Cincinnati and St. Louis. And Baltimore, actually, and St. Louis. Anybody else? Thank you for coming.